I buried my grandfather on a Tuesday, and by Thursday I was holding a map that would unravel everything I thought I understood about survival, about family, and about what happens to the world when nobody is paying attention. The lawyer's office smelled like old leather and stale coffee. My name is Elias Morrow, and I was 29 years old when a man in a pinstripe suit slid a yellowed envelope across a mahogany desk and told me my grandfather, Henry Morrow, had left me a single item. Not the farmhouse, not the 60 acres of Virginia timber, not the truck or the savings bonds. My cousin Rebecca got those. My uncle Dale received the tool collection and the mineral rights. I received an envelope sealed with candle wax, and inside it, a hand-drawn map of a region I did not recognize. The map was meticulous. My grandfather had been a cartographer for the Army Corps of Engineers before retiring to the Shenandoah Valley in 1987. His draftsmanship was impeccable contour lines rendered in brown ink, waterways in blue, structures marked with tiny architectural footprints. The region depicted covered roughly 12 square miles of dense Appalachian terrain. There were numbered locations, annotations in his tight, slanted handwriting. And at the center of the map, a single area circled in red ink so thick it had bled through the paper. Beneath the circle, one sentence: never go there after dark. Rebecca called me that evening while I was sitting in my apartment in Richmond, the map spread across my kitchen table under a desk lamp. "What did he leave you?" she asked. I told her. She was quiet for a moment. "He talked about that map sometimes," she said. "After Grandma died, he'd sit on the porch and talk about a place up past Ridgeback Hollow. Said he'd been watching it for 30 years. I thought it was just his mind going." I asked her what he said about it. She hesitated. "He said something lived up there. Something that didn't stay dead." I almost laughed. My grandfather was a rational man, a scientist in temperament, if not in title. He built his own seismograph in the garage. He cataloged bird species with Latin precision. The idea that he believed in something supernatural felt absurd. But the map was real. The detail was extraordinary. And the red circle was drawn with a hand that pressed so hard the pen had scarred the table beneath. I called my friend Nora Vasquez the next morning. Nora was a wildlife biologist with the State Forestry Service, and she'd done field work across Western Virginia. I sent her a photo of the map. She called back within an hour. "I know this area," she said. "It's the Harker Creek watershed. There's an old mining settlement up there, abandoned since the 40s. I've never been in deep, but we've had some strange survey data from that zone. Camera traps malfunctioning, GPS drift. A couple of hunters reported seeing people up there at night, which makes no sense because the nearest road ends 6 miles out." I asked her if she'd go with me. She said yes without hesitating, then paused. "But Elias, why did your grandfather map this? What was he watching?" I didn't have an answer. Not yet. 2 days later, on a clear Saturday morning, I loaded my truck with camping gear, water purification tablets, a first aid kit, and the map sealed in a waterproof sleeve. Nora met me at a gas station outside of Staunton with her own pack, a pair of Garmin handhelds, and a look on her face that mixed curiosity with something closer to apprehension. "I pulled the Forestry Service records for Harker Creek last night," she said as she climbed into the passenger seat. "There's a notation from 2019. A survey team went in and came back a day early. The report just says unsuitable conditions. No follow-up, no explanation." She buckled her seatbelt. "And Elias? The team lead retired 2 months later. 30-year career, walked away without a pension." The road narrowed as we drove west. The mountains rose around us like the walls of something we were voluntarily entering. I kept glancing at the map on the dashboard, at that red circle, at my grandfather's handwriting. Never go there after dark. We had until sunset. The trailhead was unmarked. I would have driven past it if the map hadn't indicated a specific mile marker. 47.3, scratched into a metal post that was nearly swallowed by blackberry thicket. We parked the truck beneath a canopy of tulip poplars and stood in the gravel silence that only deep Appalachia provides. No traffic noise, no electrical hum, just the distant percussion of a woodpecker and the creek talking to itself somewhere below the ridge. Nora oriented her GPS and compared it to my grandfather's map. His coordinates are hand-plotted, but they're accurate within 10 meters, she said, tracing a fingertip along the contour lines. He knew this terrain intimately. These annotations he's marked game trails, seasonal flood lines, even wind patterns. This isn't casual work. This is decades of observation. We started walking at 9 in the morning. The trail, such as it was, followed a dry creek bed uphill through mixed hardwood forest. The footing was loose shale and damp leaves. Within the first mile, I noticed the first of my grandfather's numbered markers on the map, a small 1, circled near a rock outcropping. When we reached the corresponding spot, I found a brass survey stake driven into the stone, so old it had turned green. The number 1 was stamped into its face. He physically marked these locations, Nora said, kneeling beside it. She ran her thumb over the brass. This isn't just a map, Elias. This is a monitoring grid. We found markers 2 through 5 over the next 2 miles. Each corresponded precisely to the map. At marker 3, a narrow ravine crossing, my grandfather had written, "Increased activity noted September to November. Do not linger." At marker 5, positioned on a saddle between 2 ridges, last reliable retreat point. Beyond here, egress compromised after 1,800 hours. 1,800 hours, 6 in the evening. He was using military time. He was treating this like an operation. Nora stopped at marker 5 and pulled out her phone. No signal. She checked the Garmin. "GPS is drifting," she said. "We're showing position accuracy at 40 meters. Should be under 3. She looked up at the canopy. "Could be terrain interference, but I've worked in deeper hollows than this without drift." I unfolded the map and studied what lay ahead. Beyond marker 5, the terrain descended sharply into a bowl-shaped valley. The red circle encompassed the valley's center, where my grandfather had drawn the outlines of structures, 5 or 6 buildings arranged in a rough cluster. He'd labeled them processing facility, barracks, infirmary, storage, unknown. Beneath the cluster, in smaller writing, Harker Creek Mining Colony, established 1931, officially abandoned 1943. Actual status, active. Active. The word hit differently out here, surrounded by forest that hadn't seen maintained human presence in decades. I showed Nora. She read it twice. "Active how?" she asked. "Active meaning people live here? Active meaning the mine is operational?" She looked toward the valley. "There's nothing on satellite imagery. I checked before we left, just canopy." We pushed on. The descent was steep enough to require grabbing saplings for balance. The forest changed as we dropped in elevation. The hardwoods thinned, replaced by hemlock and rhododendron that closed overhead like a tunnel. The light dimmed. The temperature dropped by several degrees. The bird song, which had accompanied us all morning, stopped. Nora noticed it first. "Listen," she whispered. I stopped. Nothing. No birds, no insects, no wind in the canopy. Just a profound, pressurized silence. as if the valley were holding its breath. Then I smelled it, a sweetness that didn't belong in the forest. Not floral, not fungal, something organic but wrong, like fruit rotting in standing water mixed with something chemical and sharp. Nora covered her nose with her sleeve. "That's not natural decomposition," she said. "That smells like tissue preservation. Formaldehyde, maybe, mixed with biological decay." We were still 300 meters from the valley floor. The trees ahead of us were draped in something pale. At first, I thought it was lichen or old man's beard moss. But as we moved closer, I realized it was fabric strips of gauze, yellow with age, hanging from the lower branches like surgical streamers left behind by hands that no longer remembered why they'd put them there. The first building materialized through the hemlocks like a photograph, developing in chemical solution edges first, then shape, then the full ruin of it. A wooden structure, single story, with a collapsed tin roof and walls that had warped into parallelograms. The door hung open. Inside, through the green-filtered light, I could see an overturned metal table, glass bottles on the floor, and something mounted to the far wall that looked like a rack of instruments. "Don't go in," Nora said. She was studying the ground around the foundation. "Look at the soil." The earth around the building was bare, no leaf litter, no undergrowth. Just dark, compacted dirt in a perfect perimeter, as though something regularly circled the structure. The pattern was too uniform for animal trails and too deliberate for water erosion. We moved through the settlement carefully, cataloging what we saw against my grandfather's map. The barracks were 2 long buildings, with rows of iron bed frames visible through shattered windows. The storage building had been reinforced at some point with concrete blocks that didn't match the original construction. Someone had come back here, long after 1943, and fortified it. The structure my grandfather labeled unknown was set apart from the others, built into the hillside with a steel door that was still intact, still closed, and I noticed with a cold jolt, still padlocked. Not rusted shut, padlocked with a modern combination lock. "Someone is maintaining this," I said. Nora crouched beside a concrete block near the storage building and pointed to a mark etched into its surface. "That's a biohazard symbol," she said. "Crudely done, but deliberate. And look, there are more." She was right. Once I started looking, I saw them everywhere. Scratched into wood, painted on stone, carved into the bark of living trees. Biohazard symbols, repeated dozens of times throughout the settlement, all facing outward, as if they were warnings meant for anyone approaching from any direction. It was 11:30 in the morning. We had roughly 7 hours of usable daylight. I wanted to open the steel door. Nora wanted to survey the perimeter first. We compromised perimeter sweep, then the door. The settlement sat in a natural bowl roughly 200 meters across. A creek ran through its eastern edge, the water dark and slow-moving with an oily sheen that Nora said could indicate mineral runoff or chemical contamination. On the northern slope, we found a trench. Not a drainage ditch, a trench, dug with military precision, 4 feet deep and lined with rotting sandbags. It ran for 60 meters along the tree line before terminating at a rockfall. "This is a defensive position," I said. The recognition was instant. I'd done 2 years of Army Reserve before a knee injury discharged me. I knew a fighting position when I stood in one. Someone expected to defend this place against something coming from the north. Or to contain something from leaving to the north, Nora said quietly. At the western edge of the settlement, furthest from the trench, we found the thing that changed the nature of our expedition entirely. A cage, constructed from welded rebar and anchored to concrete pylons sunk into the ground. It was roughly 8 feet square and 6 feet tall. The door was a steel plate on industrial hinges, secured from the outside with a bolt mechanism I recognized from livestock handling equipment. The interior was scored with marks, hundreds of gouges in the metal, concentrated at the door and at the base of each wall, as if something had spent days or weeks trying to claw its way out. Nora knelt and examined the concrete base. "There's biological residue in the seams," she said. "Old, degraded. But this was used, Elias. Recently enough that the welds aren't fully oxidized." I stood outside that cage in the pale light of a Virginia afternoon and felt the first real tremor of fear. Not the intellectual curiosity I'd carried since the lawyer's office. Not the adventurer's thrill I'd felt on the trail. Fear. Because my grandfather hadn't left me a treasure map or a sentimental journey. He'd left me a surveillance record of something he'd spent 30 years watching. And he'd built this infrastructure not to study it, but to contain it. The gauze in the trees shifted in a breeze I couldn't feel. My watch read noon. 6 hours until dark. We ate lunch sitting on the concrete steps of the storage building, our packs between our knees. Neither of us had much appetite. The protein bars tasted like cardboard, and the water from my canteen had taken on the faintly metallic flavor that everything in this valley seemed to carry. "Your grandfather was coming here regularly," Nora said, studying the map again. "These annotations span years. Look, different ink colors, different pen pressures. Some of these notes are faded almost to nothing. Others are sharp and recent. He was updating this map for decades." She pointed to a series of small tick marks along the valley's southern slope. "These are count marks, grouped by date. He was tracking population." The word landed between us with uncomfortable weight. Population implied a species in this valley that warranted a cage, a trench, biohazard symbols, and a lifetime of covert observation. I pulled out a small journal I'd found tucked inside the map envelope. I hadn't mentioned it to the lawyer, and I'd barely examined it myself. The handwriting was my grandfather's, cramped and urgent, filling every margin. I opened to the first dated entry, March 14th, 1989. Returned to Harker Creek after snowmelt. Colony structures intact. Evidence of winter activity. Checks in remaining snow around the infirmary. Counted 11 distinct trail patterns. Previous autumn count was 8. Growth rate accelerating. Specimens observed at dusk from ridge position. Movement patterns consistent with previous observations. Erratic, non-purposeful during daylight. Purposeful after dark. Do not understand the mechanism. Tissue sample from cage trap degraded before I could reach the university. Need cold storage solution. I read it aloud. Nora listened without interrupting, her eyes fixed on the valley floor. Specimens observed at dusk. Erratic, non-purposeful during daylight. Purposeful after dark. He was studying something that lives here, I said. Something that behaves differently at night. Something he was trapping, Nora added. Something biological. He mentioned tissue samples. I flipped ahead through the journal. The entries spanned decades, growing more detailed and more alarmed. In 1994, he noted the count had risen to 19. By 2003, 31. In 2011, he wrote a single line that made the hair on my arms rise. "They are not dying. None of them are dying. The original 8 are still present. I recognize them by their injuries." Not dying, recognized by their injuries. The original 8. Nora took the journal from my hands and read the 2011 entry twice. "What does he mean?" recognized by their injuries. What kind of injuries would persist on a living organism indefinitely? I thought about the mining colony, established 1931, abandoned officially in 1943. The original 8, I said slowly. What if they're from the colony? What if they've been here since the 40s? That would make them over 80 years old at minimum, Nora said. Nothing human survives in the wild that long. Nothing. He said they're not dying. A sound reached us from the tree line to the north beyond the trench. A single sharp crack, like a branch breaking under weight. We both froze. I watched the space between the hemlocks, the shadows dense and layered. Nothing moved. But the silence that followed felt inhabited, as if something had stopped moving precisely because we'd stopped talking. Nora slowly zipped her pack and stood. We should open that steel door, she said. Whatever your grandfather was documenting, the answers are in the structure he locked. We crossed the settlement with deliberate steps, the gravel crunching too loudly beneath our boots. The modern padlock on the steel door gleamed dully. I examined it, a 4-digit combination lock, heavy-duty, weather-resistant. I tried my grandfather's birthday. Nothing. My grandmother's. Nothing. Then, on instinct, I tried the year the colony was officially abandoned. 1943. The lock clicked open. The steel door swung inward on oiled hinges maintained, recently revealing a passage cut into the hillside. The walls were raw stone, reinforced with timber beams. The air that breathed out from the darkness was cold and carried that same sweet chemical smell, intensified to the point where my eyes watered. Nora switched on her headlamp. The beam cut into the dark and illuminated a corridor that extended beyond its reach. After you, she whispered. She wasn't joking. The corridor ran straight for 40 meters before opening into a chamber carved from the native rock. The ceiling was low. I had to duck slightly, and the walls were lined with metal shelving units bolted directly into the stone. On those shelves, in rows so precise they could have been arranged by a machine, sat glass jars. Hundreds of them. Quart-sized mason jars with rubber-sealed lids, each containing a murky amber fluid and a solid mass I couldn't immediately identify. Nora moved to the nearest shelf and lifted a jar to her headlamp. The fluid swirled. Inside, suspended in the preservation solution, was a piece of tissue, grayish, fibrous, roughly the size of a fist. She rotated the jar slowly. Muscle tissue, she said. Human, possibly, preserved in what looks like a formalin solution. She checked the lid. A strip of adhesive tape bore a date and a designation. HC-03, Sample 14, September 1997. H.C. Harker Creek. The numbering system matched the journal entries. We moved deeper into the chamber. A workbench occupied the far wall, a proper laboratory bench with a mounted magnifying lamp, a dissection kit in a leather roll, and a stack of composition notebooks identical to the journal in my pack. I opened the top notebook. My grandfather's handwriting filled the pages with observational data. Cellular structure notes, degradation rates, metabolic analyses performed with equipment I could see stored beneath the bench, a portable microscope, chemical reagent kits, staining supplies. He was running a one-man research operation, Nora said, looking over my shoulder. For 30-plus years. Without institutional support, without funding, without telling anyone. He told me, I said, in his way. He left me the map. Nora pulled another notebook from the stack, this one dated 2018, and began reading aloud. Specimen HC-01, observed at close range from blind position, 4:30 hours. Subject remains ambulatory despite tissue degradation, consistent with approximately 75 years of environmental exposure. Musculature atrophied, but functional. No evidence of normal biological maintenance. No feeding observed. No water consumption. No waste elimination. Subject responds to sound and movement stimuli, with delayed orientation during daylight hours. After sunset, response time decreases to near instantaneous. Pupil dilation in nocturnal conditions suggests enhanced photoreceptor adaptation. Subject HC-01 continues to wear fragments of original clothing consistent with 1940s-era workwear. She stopped reading and looked at me. Elias, he's describing a person who's been alive or something close to alive since the 1940s. A person who doesn't eat, doesn't drink, doesn't die, and becomes more dangerous after dark. He's describing an infected person, I said. The word felt inadequate, but it was the only framework I had. Something happened at this mining colony, something that changed the workers, and they're still here. A metallic scrape echoed from somewhere deeper in the tunnel system beyond the chamber, through a secondary passage I hadn't noticed, cut into the rock at the far corner. We both turned toward it. My headlamp beam found the passage opening, narrower than the main corridor, with rough-hewn walls and a downward slope. That leads deeper into the mine, Nora whispered. The scrape came again, metal on stone, rhythmic, purposeful. I checked my watch, 1:45 in the afternoon. We had 4.5 hours of daylight. The smart choice, the choice my grandfather would have made, was to document what we'd found and leave. Come back with more people, better equipment, authority figures who could make sense of this. But the sound from the passage pulled at something in me that wasn't rational. My grandfather had spent 30 years alone with this secret. He'd built a laboratory inside a mountain. He'd counted specimens and taken tissue samples and written thousands of pages of observations. And in the end, the only person he'd trusted with this knowledge was me. I stepped toward the passage. Elias. Nora's voice was sharp. We don't know what's down there. That's exactly why I have to look. She grabbed my arm. Your grandfather didn't tell you to come here and investigate. He told you never to come here after dark. That implies daylight is safe. Not that the location is safe. There's a difference. She was right. But I was already moving. The secondary passage descended at a 15-degree angle for approximately 60 meters before leveling out into a wider tunnel that bore the unmistakable marks of industrial mining rail tracks set into the floor, timber supports at regular intervals, ventilation shafts drilled upward into the rock. The air temperature had dropped to near refrigeration levels, and our breath formed pale clouds in our headlamp beams. The scraping sound had stopped. In its absence, the silence was so complete that I could hear the blood moving through my ears and the faint ticking of Nora's watch. The tunnel branched. Left led deeper into darkness. Right opened into a wider space from which a faint gray light emanated natural light, filtering down through some crack or shaft in the rock above. We went right. The chamber was enormous. A cathedral carved from limestone, its ceiling lost in shadow, its floor covered in fine mineral dust that recorded every disturbance with forensic clarity. Industrial equipment lined the walls, drilling machinery, ore carts, lengths of chain and cable. Everything coated in decades of calcite deposits, frozen in mineral time. Except the footprints. The floor was covered in footprints. Hundreds of them, thousands, overlapping in every direction, some so fresh The dust hadn't settled back into them. Human footprints, bare feet, the toes splayed, the impressions deep enough to suggest significant body weight, despite what my grandfather's notes described as atrophied musculature. They gather here, Nora breathed. During the day, they come underground. I swept my headlamp across the chamber and saw them. Along the far wall, in the deepest shadows, where the ambient light from above couldn't reach, shapes size stood motionless, upright human forms, pressed against the stone like sculptures left unfinished. I counted 9 before my light began to tremble in my grip. They were standing with their arms at their sides, their heads slightly bowed, their eyes those that still had eyes closed. They wore the remnants of clothing so degraded it was impossible to determine original color or style, though on the nearest figure I could make out the ghost of denim overalls and a leather belt that had calcified against the hip. They weren't breathing. Their chests didn't move. But they were standing, balanced, vertical, defying every law of biology I understood. Nora gripped my shoulder from behind so hard her fingers would leave bruises. "Back up," she whispered. "Slowly. No sudden movements." I couldn't move. The nearest figure was 12 feet away. Its skin was the color and texture of old leather stretched over a frame that had lost all subcutaneous fat. The face was a topographic map of desiccation, sunken cheeks, exposed tendons at the jaw, lips retracted from teeth that were intact and, impossibly, white. The hair was thin and colorless, clinging to a scalp mottled with mineral deposits. HC-01, I thought. My grandfather had watched this individual for 30 years. This person had been a miner, had a name, had come to work one morning in the 1940s and never left. One of the figures deeper in the cluster twitched. A single movement, the right hand opening and closing, fingers curling against the thigh. Nora pulled me backward. I stumbled on the rail tracks. The sound of my boot on metal rang through the chamber with shocking volume. Every head lifted simultaneously. I have never experienced a terror so pure and so complete. 9 heads rising in unison, 9 faces turning toward the sound with the synchronized precision of a flock responding to a predator's shadow. Their eyes opened. The irises were pale, almost white, clouded with mineral opacity, but unmistakably tracking, unmistakably oriented on the 2 living bodies standing in their cathedral. "Run," Nora said. Not a whisper, a command. We ran, back through the tunnel, up the ascending passage, our headlamps throwing wild circles on the walls. Behind us, no sound of pursuit. Nothing, just the terrible possibility that something was following in perfect silence. We burst into the laboratory chamber and kept going. Through the corridor, past the steel door, into the afternoon light. I spun and slammed the door shut, fumbling the padlock back through the hasp with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The lock clicked shut. Nora bent double, hands on her knees, gasping. "They were dormant," she said between breaths. "Daylight dormancy. Your grandfather was right. They're different at night." My watch read 2:15. We had less than 4 hours. We should have left. Every rational impulse in my body screamed to climb the ridge, reach the truck, drive to the nearest town, and call every authority from the CDC to the National Guard. But Nora was already unpacking her GPS unit and checking coordinates, and I was already reopening the journal. And we were both already trapped in the orbit of something too extraordinary to abandon. "We have time," Nora said, though her voice still carried the vibration of what we'd seen underground. "We document everything we can, and we leave by 5 at the latest. That gives us a full hour of daylight buffer plus hiking time. I opened the journal to the final entries. My grandfather's handwriting in the last pages had changed larger, less controlled. The pen pressed harder. The final dated entry was November 3rd, 2024, 8 days before his death. The count has reached 53. Growth has been consistent for the past decade. 2 to 4 new specimens per year. Origin of new specimens unknown. I have never observed the conversion process directly. One theory. The mind system extends further than colonial-era surveys indicate. There may be additional populations in deeper chambers that I cannot access. Second theory. Conversion occurs underground, out of sight. Living individuals enter the mind system, lost hikers, vagrants, those who wander too far and do not emerge as themselves. I am dying. The doctors have given me weeks. I have failed in my original objective, which was to understand the mechanism and develop a countermeasure. What I leave behind is observation without solution. The map goes to Elias. He served in uniform. He has the temperament. He will know what to do, or he will know who to call. I did not call anyone because I was afraid of what would be done, not to the specimens, but to the valley. They would burn it, bomb it, erase it, and the mechanism would be lost. Whatever transformed those miners in the 1940s could also be the key to understanding cellular persistence, metabolic suspension, neurological reactivation. The science is extraordinary. The danger is real. These two facts have governed my silence for 30 years. If Elias goes to the valley, he must remember the one rule. After dark, they become something else entirely. Not sluggish remnants, not dormant shells. After dark, they hunt. They are fast. They are coordinated. They communicate through sounds I cannot replicate or record. My equipment fails every time. After dark, the valley belongs to them. I closed the journal. Nora had been reading over my shoulder, her headlamp creating a second pool of light on the pages. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. 53, she finally said. In the mine, we saw 9. Where are the other 44? The question opened a trap door beneath my thoughts. The mine system. If my grandfather was right about it extending beyond known surveys, there could be chambers and passages running for miles beneath the mountains. 53 specimens standing in the dark, waiting for sunset, existing in a state that defied every biological principle. We need to leave, I said. But first, I'm taking the notebooks. All of them. His research can't stay here. We moved back toward the steel door. I unlocked it again and entered the laboratory quickly, loading the composition notebooks into my pack while Nora photographed the jar collection with her phone. The chemical smell was worse now, or maybe my senses were heightened by adrenaline. Every sound from the deeper passages made my pulse spike. Nora stopped photographing and stood still, her head tilted in a listening posture I recognized from years of watching her track animals in the field. "Do you hear that?" she asked. I listened. From the secondary passage, the one leading down to the mine cathedral, came a sound. Low, resonant, hovering at the threshold of audibility. A hum, not mechanical, organic. Multiple sources harmonizing at a frequency that vibrated in my sternum rather than my ears. "They're awake," I said. "The sun hasn't set," Nora countered. "It's barely 3 o'clock. Maybe they don't need full dark. Maybe they just need us to come close enough." We took the notebooks and left the mountain. The padlock clicked behind us for the second time that day. And this time, as we walked away, I heard the steel door vibrate in its frame from the other side. The climb out of the valley was harder than the descent. Gravity fought us. The terrain forced us to use all 4 limbs in places, and the weight of the notebooks in my pack added 15 pounds I hadn't carried on the way in. But fear is a remarkable fuel. We moved faster ascending than we had all day. At marker 5, the last reliable retreat point, we stopped to catch our breath. The sun had crossed its zenith and was tracking westward, gilding the ridgeline in amber light that made the forest look deceptively peaceful. From our elevated position, I could see the valley below, the settlement's tin roofs glinting through gaps in the canopy. "I need to tell you something," Nora said. She was sitting on a flat rock, her pack between her feet, her face carrying an expression I'd never seen on her, not just fear, but culpability. "I didn't agree to come here purely out of curiosity." I waited. 6 months ago, one of our survey teams found something during a routine wildlife corridor assessment about 4 miles north of here. A deer carcass, completely drained of fluid, not blood, all fluid. Desiccated like jerky, but fresh. The tissue had been alive within hours. Our lab couldn't explain the mechanism. We filed it as anomalous, and I forgot about it until you showed me the map. She met my eyes. 3 weeks later, a hiker went missing on the Harker Creek Trail. Samuel Oren, age 41, experienced backpacker. Search and rescue found his camp intact. Food, water, pack, everything. No sign of struggle. He simply wasn't there anymore. The search was called off after 9 days. You think he went into the valley? I think something from the valley found him. She pulled her phone out and opened a photo. I took this from the Forestry Service database before we left. The image showed a map, a professional GIS rendering of the Harker Creek watershed, with colored dots representing wildlife camera trap locations. Several of the dots were marked with red X's. These cameras all failed within a 3-month window last autumn. When the team retrieved them, the memory cards were intact, but the images were corrupted. Every single one. Except... She swiped to another photo. A trail camera image, green tinted with infrared, time-stamped 2:47 a.m. In the frame, partially obscured by a hemlock trunk, stood a human figure, motionless, facing the camera. The face was a pale smear, the eyes 2 bright points of infrared reflection, the body wrapped in what appeared to be disintegrating fabric. This was captured 1,400 meters from the valley perimeter, Nora said. They're ranging further, Elias. Whatever containment your grandfather thought he was maintaining, it's failing. I stared at the image. The figure stood with the same posture I'd seen in the mine, arms at sides, head slightly tilted, but it was above ground. At night, 1,400 meters from the settlement, close enough to reach a maintained trail, close enough to reach a campsite, close enough to reach Samuel Oren. "Why didn't you tell me this before we went in?" I asked. "Because I wasn't sure, and because I needed to see it for myself." She put the phone away. "I'm sure now. We need to contact the State Health Department, the Forestry Service chain of command, maybe the military. This isn't a scientific curiosity anymore. If the population is growing and the range is expanding. My grandfather spent 30 years keeping this quiet because he was afraid they'd destroy it." "Elias." Her voice hardened. "A man is missing, probably dead. Those things in the mine aren't a research opportunity, they're a public safety crisis. Your grandfather's silence might have cost lives." The accusation hit me in a place I wasn't prepared for. She was right. My grandfather's devotion to understanding the mechanism had blinded him to the immediate human cost of secrecy. And now, I was holding his notebooks, inheriting not just his knowledge, but his moral compromise. The sun dropped another degree toward the ridge. The shadows in the valley lengthened like reaching hands. "Let's get to the truck," I said. "We can argue about disclosure on the drive back." We started moving. We didn't get far. The trail between markers 5 and 3 passed through a narrow saddle where the ridgeline compressed into a spine of exposed rock, flanked by dense rhododendron thickets. In the morning, we'd pass through it quickly, noting the beauty of the filtered light and the way the rock formations created a natural corridor. Now, in the declining afternoon, the corridor felt like a bottleneck. Nora stopped so suddenly, I nearly collided with her pack. She held up a fist, a military signal she'd picked up from working with veteran conservation officers. I froze. Ahead of us, standing in the middle of the trail where it narrowed between 2 rock walls, was a man. Not one of the mine specimens. A living man, wearing modern hiking boots, cargo pants, and a gray fleece pullover. He had a short brown beard and sunglasses pushed up on his forehead. He was standing with his hands in his pockets, as if he'd been waiting. "Afternoon," he said. His voice was calm, conversational, utterly incongruent with the location. "You two come from the valley?" I didn't answer immediately. Nora shifted her weight beside me. I could feel her tension radiating like heat. "Who are you?" I asked. "Name's Mercer. Dale Mercer." He smiled without warmth. "I'm what you might call a custodian." "A custodian of what?" "Of the work. Henry's work." He took his hands from his pockets. They were empty. "You're Elias. He told me about you. Said you'd come eventually." He looked at Nora. "Didn't mention a +1. "You knew my grandfather," I said. It wasn't a question. "Knew him. I've been his field partner for the last 11 years. Who do you think maintained the lock? Oiled the door hinges? Ran supply trips for the lab?" He gestured around him. Henry was a brilliant man, but he was also 87 years old. He needed boots on the ground. The revelation reordered my understanding with jarring speed. My grandfather hadn't been alone. He'd had a partner, someone younger, physically capable, who'd been maintaining the infrastructure and presumably continuing the observations after my grandfather became too ill to make the trek. "You've been in the valley," Nora said. "Recently." "I was there this morning," Mercer said. "Watched you two stumble down the slope from the ridge observation post binoculars 300 meters out. Watched you enter the lab. Watched you go into the mine." His expression shifted from casual to something colder. That was unbelievably stupid. The specimens are in transitional state this time of year. Seasonal shift days are getting longer. Their dormancy cycle is unstable. You could have triggered a cascade. "A cascade," I repeated. "A mass awakening event. It's happened twice in the years I've been here. The second time, I barely made the tree line. They are not what you think they are during daylight, and they are far worse than anything you can imagine after dark." "We're leaving," I said. "We have the notebooks. We're going to bring in proper authorities." Mercer's face changed. The casual veneer dropped away, replaced by something desperate and fierce. "You're not bringing anyone. Henry and I spent over a decade developing a containment protocol that keeps those things in the valley. You bring in the government, they'll send a hazmat team first, then a military team second. And within a month, this entire valley will be under a concrete cap. And everything Henry documented will be classified into oblivion." "People are dying," Nora said. "A hiker went missing." "Samuel Oren," Mercer said. "I know. I found what was left of him." A muscle in his jaw tightened. 300 meters outside the valley perimeter, He'd camped at dusk, and the night patrol caught his scent. By the time I reached his site, the conversion had already begun. Conversion, Nora whispered. That's what Henry called it. The mechanism isn't death, it's transformation. The mining colony didn't collapse because the workers died, it collapsed because they stopped being workers. Something in the mine changed them, kept them alive but rewrote their purpose. And whatever it is, it's communicable. Through sustained physical contact, through fluid exchange, through means I still don't fully understand. The sun touched the ridgeline. Golden light flooded the saddle. You need to decide right now, Mercer said. Come with me, or run. Mercer led us along a route that didn't appear on my grandfather's map. A game trail that switched back up the northern slope to a concealed position overlooking the valley. A platform had been built between two massive oaks, 10 feet off the ground, accessed by a rope ladder. The platform was solid, pressure-treated lumber, bolted joints, a canvas tarp for weather protection. It was a permanent observation blind. And from it, the entire settlement was visible in miniature below. Henry built the first version in the 90s, Mercer said, pulling the ladder up behind us. I rebuilt it 4 years ago after a windstorm took the original down. This is where we watched. This is where you'll understand. We need to leave before dark, Nora said. She'd checked her watch 3 times during the climb. 4:47 p.m. Sunset was at 8:12, but the valley would lose direct light much earlier due to the surrounding ridgelines. Effective darkness in the bowl could arrive by 7. You won't make the trailhead in time, Mercer said flatly. Not from here, not on that trail. The slope is too steep and the footing's too loose. You try it in fading light. One of you breaks an ankle, and then you're on the ground in the dark within their range. Up here, you're safe. They don't climb. Something about vertical movement disrupts their coordination. How do you know that? I asked. Because Henry tested it. Repeatedly. Methodically. That man was more rigorous than half the researchers I studied under at Virginia Tech. Mercer opened a weatherproof container bolted to the platform and extracted a pair of night vision binoculars, a thermal monocular, and a handheld radio. We wait. We watch. At dawn, you leave. And then we have a very serious conversation about what happens next. I didn't like being told what to do by a stranger on a wooden platform in the middle of Appalachian wilderness. But the logic was sound. The math of the remaining daylight versus the terrain between us and the truck left no margin for error. If Mercer was right that the specimens didn't climb, the platform was our safest option. Nora sat with her back against one of the oak trunks, her pack in her lap. Her jaw set in an expression I recognized as controlled fury. She didn't trust Mercer. Neither did I entirely. But his knowledge was too specific and too integrated with my grandfather's work to be fabricated. Tell me about the conversion, I said. Mercer settled into a camp chair that was permanently fixed to the platform and adjusted the thermal monocular. Henry's theory, which I've come to share, is that the Harker Creek mine intersected a geological deposit containing a previously unidentified biological agent. Not a virus, not a bacterium, something older. A mineral-organic hybrid, a crystalline structure with properties that interact with human cellular architecture in ways that shouldn't be possible. The miners in the 40s were the first exposed. Extended contact with the deposit altered their biology at a fundamental level. Cellular death was suppressed. Metabolic function was replaced by something we can't fully characterize. Neurological activity was reorganized around stimulus response rather than conscious thought. They're not conscious? Nora asked. During the day, they're barely functional. Ambulatory but aimless. At night, they become something else focused, fast, cooperative. They communicate through subsonic vocalizations. They hunt in coordinated patterns. Henry recorded their nighttime movements for 20 years, and the behavioral complexity is extraordinary. Pack dynamics, flanking maneuvers, sentry positioning. They're not mindless. But they're not people anymore, I said. No. Mercer's voice was quiet. They're what people become when the agent rewrites them. And the rewriting doesn't stop. Each year they're slightly different, slightly more organized, slightly more efficient. He lowered his voice. Slightly hungrier. The light in the valley had turned the color of bruised fruit. The settlement below was falling into shadow, the tin roofs losing their gleam, the spaces between buildings filling with pooling darkness. Mercer raised the thermal monocular to his eye and went still. There, he said. South entrance of the mine. They're emerging. He handed me the monocular. I looked. Through the green-white palette of thermal imaging, I watched the first figure step from the mine entrance into the open air. It moved with a fluidity that contradicted everything I'd seen in the cathedral. No dormant rigidity, no sluggish orientation. It walked upright, with its head turning in smooth arcs, scanning the tree line, testing the air. A second emerged behind it, then a third, then a steady procession that continued for a full minute. I counted 41 before I lost track in the overlapping thermal signatures. They fanned out from the mine entrance like mercury released from a vessel, filling the spaces between buildings, spreading to the perimeter, some moving to the trench line, others drifting toward the creek. Their body temperatures registered as anomalous on the thermal cooler than living humans, but warmer than ambient air. A metabolic signature that occupied a space between alive and environmental. The remaining 12 are probably in the deeper sections, Mercer said. Henry cataloged their emergence patterns. Not all of them surface every night. Some remain underground permanently, the oldest ones, the most degraded. HCO1 through HCO4 haven't been seen above ground since 2019. What are the ones above ground doing? Nora asked. She was watching through the standard binoculars Mercer had provided, squinting to see in the dying light. Patrolling, Mercer said. For the first hour after emergence, they establish a perimeter. Then they begin ranging outward in expanding arcs. By midnight, the furthest will be 2, maybe 3 miles from the settlement. They return before dawn. 3 miles, Nora said. The camera trap image I showed Elias was captured 1,400 meters out. That's well within their operational range, Mercer confirmed. Last October, I tracked one as far as 4 miles north. It was moving fast, faster than I could follow on foot. When the nights are longest, their range extends proportionally. The valley below was now fully in shadow. The sky retained a pale indigo at the ridgeline, but the bowl was dark. Through the thermal monocular, the figures had dispersed into the tree line, their signatures moving between the trunks like phosphorescent ghosts, weaving patterns that, Mercer was right, suggested coordination rather than random wandering. Then the sound began. It rose from the valley floor like something physical, a vibration that bypassed my ears and resonated in my chest cavity, in the spaces between my ribs, in the fluid chambers of my skull. A subsonic tone that carried harmonics I felt rather than heard. The trees around our platform seemed to lean toward the sound, or maybe I was swaying. Close your mouth, Mercer said sharply. Breathe through your nose. The vocalization can trigger vestibular disruption if you're not prepared. I clenched my jaw. The sensation diminished, but didn't disappear. Nora gripped the platform railing with both hands, her knuckles white. It's a coordination signal, Mercer continued. his voice clinical despite the circumstances. They use it to synchronize movement patterns. Henry called it the chorus. It typically lasts 3 to 5 minutes at the onset, then diminishes to intermittent pulses throughout the night. The chorus intensified, then faded, then pulsed again. Below, through the monocular, I watched the thermal signatures respond, shifting direction in unison. The entire dispersed network of bodies reorienting like a school of fish, turning in response to a current only they could feel. One of the figures stopped moving. It was at the base of the northern slope, perhaps 100 meters below our platform. Through thermal imaging, I could see it clearly, head raised, face angled upward, oriented directly toward us. "It knows we're here," I said. "It's aware of thermal anomalies in its patrol zone," Mercer corrected. "It can probably detect our body heat from that range. But it won't climb. I've tested this extensively. Vertical movement above approximately 8 feet creates a disorientation response. They lose coordination and retreat." The figure below remained motionless for 30 seconds, its face pointed at our platform. Then it turned and continued its patrol, moving westward along the slope's base with the precise, unhurried gait of a predator that knew it had all night. None of us spoke for a long time. The stars emerged. The chorus continued, pulsing through the dark valley like the heartbeat of something vast and patient. Around 11 p.m., Nora fell asleep with her back against the oak trunk, her body finally surrendering to exhaustion despite the environment. Mercer kept watch through the thermal monocular with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent hundreds of nights on this platform. I sat between them, too wired to sleep, reading my grandfather's notebooks by the dim red light of a headlamp set to its lowest output. The notebooks were organized chronologically, and reading them in sequence was like watching a man's worldview transform in real time. The early entries were scientific in tone, observational, measured, careful. By the mid-2000s, they'd shifted towards something more philosophical. My grandfather had begun wrestling with questions that exceeded his training. October 2007. What obligation do I have to these specimens? If they retain no consciousness, no identity, no memory of their human lives, are they still persons under any meaningful definition? They were minors once. They had families. Some of those families may still exist grandchildren, great-grandchildren who never learned what happened to the men who went into Harker Creek and never came back. Do those families have a right to know? Do the specimens themselves have a right to rest? March 2012. Specimen HC-09 approached the cage trap today, but did not enter. It stood at the threshold for 40 minutes, motionless, staring at the bait, thermal pack simulating body heat. Then it reached in, removed the bait, placed it on the ground outside the trap, and walked away. This is problem-solving behavior. This is recognition of the trap as a trap. They are learning. August 2016. Night observation from blind. Counted all active specimens in coordinated movement pattern. They were circling the settlement in a counterclockwise spiral, tightening toward the center over a period of 3 hours. The center of the spiral was the mine entrance. They returned underground in single file. In numerical order, I confirm this. With the identification markers I've tracked, HC05 first, then HC06, then sequential through the recent additions. It is a ritual. There is no functional purpose to this movement. It is a ritual, and rituals imply culture. I set the notebook down. Culture. My grandfather had spent his final years grappling with the possibility that these transformed miners had developed a social structure, that whatever the agent had done to their neurology hadn't simply erased them. It had rebuilt them around new organizing principles. They weren't dead. They weren't mindless. They were something unprecedented. And my grandfather had recognized that destroying them would be an act of erasure, comparable to the loss of a species. He loved them, I said aloud. Mercer turned from the monocular. He respected them, Mercer corrected. There's a difference. Henry respected the fact that they represented something science had never encountered. He didn't sentimentalize them. He knew what they could do. He watched HC-17 convert Samuel Oren, sat up here with binoculars and watched a man die and come back as something else. It nearly broke him. He watched it happen and didn't intervene? Nora's voice came from the darkness. She wasn't asleep after all. Mercer's silence lasted too long. He was 86 years old, half a mile away at night. What was he supposed to do? Call for help, Nora said. Years before, not watch a population of infectious predators grow unchecked while protecting his research. His research is the only reason we understand what we're dealing with, Mercer snapped. Without 30 years of observation data, anyone who comes to deal with this is starting blind. Anyone who comes to deal with this might have saved lives that your research cost. The argument hung between them like a blade. I understood both positions completely and found myself unable to side with either. My grandfather's moral calculus had been complex and, in its way, rational. But rationality built on secrecy has a fatal flaw. It assumes the secret keeper is infallible. He wasn't infallible, he was human. And now he was dead. And the decision was mine. A new sound rose from the valley, not the chorus, but something sharper. A scream. Human in pitch, but inhuman in duration. Sustaining for 15 seconds, without pause for breath. It echoed off the rock walls and faded into the hemlocks. No one spoke. The scream did not repeat. Dawn arrived, not as a moment, but as a gradual negotiation between light and dark. The sky shifting from black to charcoal to steel to the first pale blue that meant the sun was approaching the ridgeline. I'd been awake all night. My eyes ached. My body was stiff from hours of immobility on the wooden platform. But the light brought a relief so profound, it felt physical, a loosening in my chest, a release of tension I'd been carrying in every muscle. Through the thermal monocular, I'd watched the specimens return to the mine over the preceding hour. They moved with deliberate purpose, converging from all directions, the expanding patrol network collapsing back to center like a contracting lung. By the time the first direct sunlight crested the ridge, the valley was empty. Every figure had disappeared underground. Mercer packed the observation equipment into the weatherproof container. His movements were efficient, practiced. This was routine for him. He'd been doing this every few weeks for over a decade. The thought staggered me. I need to ask you something, I said. And I need the truth. He paused. Ask. Have you been converted? Exposed? Is there any possibility that you're carrying the agent? His eyes met mine, and I saw something unexpected in them, not offense, but recognition. As if he'd asked himself the same question many times. Henry tested me annually. Blood draws, tissue samples, comparison against baseline. I've been careful, full protective equipment when I enter the lab. No direct specimen contact, no time in the deep mine chambers without respiratory protection. I'm clean. My last test was 2 months ago. I want those results, Nora said. She'd climbed to her feet and was stretching with the careful movements of someone whose body had been punished by a night on wooden planks. I want every test result, every notebook, every data point your operation has generated. And then I want a meeting with people who have the authority and resources to deal with this. Mercer looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at me. Elias, your grandfather wanted you to have this. Not the government, not the forestry service. You. My grandfather is dead, I said, and the words carried more weight than I expected. He gave me the map and one rule. I broke the rule last night. I stayed after dark. And what I saw told me that one man or two men can't contain this. The count is growing. The range is expanding. The specimens are learning. If we don't act now with everything we know, the next person who wanders into this valley won't have a platform to climb. Mercer's jaw worked. He dropped the rope ladder and descended without another word. Nora followed. I went last, my grandfather's notebooks heavy in my pack, the morning light falling across the valley in clean geometric planes that made the settlement below look almost peaceful. We hiked in silence. The forest sounded normal birds calling territory, squirrels chattering in the canopy, the creek audible as we climbed toward the ridge. It was as if the night had never happened. As if the valley held its horrors in a compartment sealed by sunlight, available only to those who stayed past the threshold. At marker 3, the narrow ravine where my grandfather had noted increased activity, I stopped and looked back. The valley was visible as a green depression in the mountains, indistinguishable from dozens of similar hollows in the Shenandoah Range. Beautiful, unremarkable, a place you'd pass on a scenic overlook and never think about again. 53 figures stood in the darkness beneath it, waiting for the sun to fail. We reached the truck at 9:15 in the morning. Mercer's vehicle, a battered Jeep with forestry service plates that Nora noted with grim interest, was parked 50 yards down the road. He'd been following us since the trailhead, maybe since before. I unlocked the truck and set my pack on the passenger seat. The map lay on the dashboard where I'd left it. My grandfather's red circle stared up at me. His handwriting, his rule, never go there after dark. I'd broken it. And now I carried the consequence, the knowledge that the dark held more than absence. It held a patient, growing intelligence that hadn't forgotten how to hunt. We drove to Staunton in a 3-vehicle convoy, my truck in front, Nora's sedan in the middle, Mercer's Jeep trailing reluctantly behind. The drive took 90 minutes, and I spent every mile of it constructing a plan that balanced my grandfather's desire for scientific preservation with the undeniable reality that people were in danger. Nora made calls from the gas station where we'd originally met. Her supervisor at the Forestry Service, the regional director of the Virginia Department of Health, a colleague at Virginia Tech's biosafety program. By the time she'd finished, 4 separate agencies had been notified of a potential biological hazard in the Harker Creek watershed, and a preliminary assessment team was being assembled for the following week. Mercer stood by his Jeep, smoking a cigarette with the mechanical rhythm of a man watching his life's architecture disassemble. I walked over to him. "I'm not going to let them destroy the research," I said. "That's a promise. Whatever my grandfather documented belongs to science, not to a classified file cabinet." "You don't control that," he said. "The moment the government gets involved, you lose control of everything." Maybe, but my grandfather also lost control. He just didn't admit it. The population outgrew his containment. The range exceeded his monitoring capacity. Samuel O'Fren died because one man's surveillance wasn't enough. Mercer dropped his cigarette and ground it under his heel. "Henry said you'd see it clearly. Said you'd do the right thing, even if it hurt." He reached into his Jeep and produced a hard-sided case, which he handed to me. Inside, packed in foam, were 6 USB drives, each labeled with a date range. Digitized copies of everything. Every notebook, every observation log, every test result. If the originals disappear into a government vault, those don't. I took the case. Come to the meeting next week. Tell them what you've told us. You're the only person alive who's seen this up close and can explain what we're dealing with. He didn't answer, but he didn't drive away. The following week was a controlled demolition of normalcy. The assessment team composed of representatives from the Virginia Department of Health, the U.S. Forest Service, a CDC field epidemiologist, and a two-person military liaison team from Fort Liberty, assembled at a hotel conference room in Harrisonburg. Nora and I presented. I shared the map, the journals, the digital archives. Nora presented the trail camera data, the GPS anomalies, the missing persons file for Samuel Oren. The room was skeptical until I played a thermal recording Mercer had made the previous autumn from the platform, 11 minutes of footage showing coordinated specimen movement through the valley. The room went silent. The CDC epidemiologist removed her glasses and pressed her fingers to her temples. The military liaison reached for his phone. Within 72 hours, a perimeter had been established around the Harker Creek watershed. Not with soldiers, not yet, but with monitoring equipment, seismic sensors, thermal cameras, and a network of acoustic detectors calibrated to the subsonic frequencies my grandfather had described. A research team was proposed, modeled on the long-term ecological research stations that study volcanic sites and deep ocean vents. Mercer was invited to consult. He accepted. The valley wasn't bombed. It wasn't concreted over. My grandfather's fear and Mercer's proved unfounded, at least initially. The scientific community's appetite for an unprecedented biological phenomenon outweighed the military's instinct to neutralize. Harker Creek was designated a restricted biosafety zone, and research began under protocols that would have made my grandfather proud. But the specimens didn't care about our designations. On the third night of official monitoring, the acoustic sensors detected chorus activity at an intensity that exceeded every previous recording. The thermal cameras showed 97 distinct signatures emerging from the mine. 97. My grandfather's last count had been 53. The population had nearly doubled in the months since his death. Whatever restraint his presence had imposed, his traps, his patrols, his decades of interfering with their expansion was gone. They were growing faster now, and the nights were getting longer. I keep the map in a fireproof safe in my apartment in Richmond. The red circle has faded slightly from handling, but the handwriting remains clear. My grandfather's rule was simple, and I broke it. And breaking it was the only way to understand why it existed. He wasn't protecting me from the valley. He was protecting the valley from what would happen when the world learned about it. He lost that fight the moment he trusted me with the truth. Because I'm not built for silence the way he was. I carry his guilt alongside my own. The guilt of knowledge held too long and knowledge released too soon. The research station operates year-round now. They've identified the mineral agent. They're studying cellular samples under biosafety level 4 containment. Every week, new data emerges that rewrites what we thought we understood about the boundaries of human biology. And every night, from the platform my grandfather built, someone watches the valley floor fill with figures that used to be people, moving in patterns that grow more complex with each passing season. The rule was never about darkness. It was about what darkness reveals when you finally stop looking away. My name is Elias Morrow. I inherited a map. I should have followed the instructions.